On July 10th, 2012, I went to my local Best Buy and bought a Blu-ray copy of Kenneth Lonergan's film Margaret. A few years earlier, I had seen his debut film, You Can Count on Me, and fallen in love with the characters and the dialogue. You Can Count on Me is a film that came to me at exactly the right time, and it so expertly mirrored my relationship with my own sibling that I immediately wanted to seek out more films from this director. You Can Count on Me is an understated film, essentially a hangout movie, where you slowly get to build your knowledge around characters and events. There isn't so much plot as just a series of things that happen over a period of time. I learned quickly that Kenneth Lonergan, at that time, had only completed one movie as a director. His second film, as of 2007, was as yet unreleased, even though it had been shot 2 years earlier in 2005. When I looked at Lonergan's other credits as a screenwriter, I saw that he had been responsible for a draft of Analyze This, but that script went through so many revisions that much of his work was buried under layers of studio notes. I then learned that Lonergan had gotten to know Martin Scorsese through his work on Analyze This, and that Scorsese had recruited Lonergan to write a draft of the 2002 film Gangs of New York. Gangs of New York, it turns out, is a strange outlier in the space of Lonergan's career. While his stage work and his debut film are conversational, modern stories about people delivered as a slice of life, Gangs of New York is a period piece revenge film with battle sequences and larger-than-life characters. If You Can Count on Me feels inspired by Ibsen, then Gangs of New York feels inspired by Shakespeare. It's the story of a man compelled to avenge his father's death, regardless of the hurt and bloodshed and sacrifices that revenge may cause. As a director, Lonergan has now produced 3 films. Each of these films are of a piece in that they center largely on characters at crossroads in their lives. Characters who are experiencing grief and trauma, and who are looking for a way out of their current situations. Despite enormous critical success and 2 Oscar nominations following the release of You Can Count on Me, Lonergan's sophomore film, Margaret, was nearly shelved forever after a long and litigious post-production. Margaret was shot in 2005, and even though it was coming from a critically successful director and starring such talents as Anna Paquin, Matt Damon, Mark Ruffalo, Matthew Broderick, J. Smith Cameron, Jeannie Berlin, Reno, and Allison Janney, the film sat on the shelf for 6 years and earned a reputation as an unreleasable disaster. When I learned of Margaret's existence in 2007, it was unclear as to whether the film would have a release at all. However, something gave me hope. In 2006, Martin Scorsese went on record to say that an early cut of the film revealed it to be a masterpiece in the works. Scorsese believed in the project so much that he and frequent collaborator Thelma Schoonmaker offered to help edit the film into a releasable cut, but Lonergan, who had been promised final cut by distributor Fox Searchlight, dug in his heels. As time went on, and as Fox Searchlight became more impatient with Lonergan's slow editing process, lawsuits started to get filed. Years passed, and a theatrical release of Margaret became less and less likely. And then, in 2011, 2 separate cuts of the movie were released in New York theaters. One cut, usually referred to as the theatrical cut, ran at 150 minutes, and a longer, extended cut ran at 186 minutes. Even though the extended cut is sometimes called the director's cut, Lonergan himself denies this claim. Instead, he just calls it an additional, expanded version of the film. On release, Margaret was met with mixed critical response. Some critics, who knew the movie mostly by its complicated production history, called the film a near disaster, or at least a compromised object, while others championed the film as one of the best of the new century. When I finally sat down to watch Margaret for the first time on July 10th, 2012, I wasn't sure what I was going to think of it. Was it going to live up to the years of hype I'd been building up in my mind? Was it going to feel like a finished film? Margaret follows the story of Lisa Cohen, a teenage girl who lives with her single mother in Manhattan. Lisa's mother, played by J. Smith Cameron of Succession fame, is a stage actor performing in a successful Broadway play. Lisa, growing up in a wealthy Manhattan neighborhood, attends a private school and has free reign of New York in the afternoons. She attends parties, experiments with drugs, and causes drama in her tight social circle. In an early scene, as Lisa shops for a cowboy hat, she sees a bus driver played by Mark Ruffalo wearing the hat she thinks she wants. When she tries to get his attention by flirting with him, he gets distracted from the road, runs a red light, and hits a woman as she crosses the street. The woman dies in Lisa's arms, and, feeling responsible for the accident, Lisa's life begins to unravel. It's a sprawling film that reckons with adolescence in far more realistic ways than I have ever seen portrayed before or since in a movie. In the years since I first watched it, Margaret has only grown in my estimation. I see it as perhaps the best movie of the 21st century so far, and it is my go-to recommendation for people who are interested in watching something new. It makes sense that Margaret was difficult to complete. Its central character, Lisa Cohen, is almost too realistically drawn in her adolescent complexity. She is selfish, hypocritical, judgmental, and annoying. Spending time with her reminds you of how awful you were when you were a teenager. The adults in her life struggle to help her, and their constant frustration with her is mirrored by the audience. A production company like Fox Searchlight would likely suggest edits to Lisa's character to soften her and make her more likable. They may ask for the film's epic runtime to be tightened, for many of the novelistic subplots to be removed or simplified. Even the title is a tough sell, considering there isn't a single character in the film named Margaret. Instead, the title is a reference to a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, read by Matthew Broderick's character, Lisa's dorky English teacher. The expansive psychological drama of Margaret realistically captures the nuances of adolescence. The characterization of Lisa is as fully realized as those of the novels of George Eliot or Fyodor Dostoevsky. But what's so profound about what Lonergan and Paquin have done is that they have been able to craft this character through just a couple of hours of screen time. What takes a novelist sometimes hundreds of pages to achieve, Lonergan does in just a fraction of the time. Margaret is such an epic film in scope and ambition that it feels much larger than it actually is, somehow forever expanding in your mind long after you've seen it. In order for me to fully unpack what makes Margaret such a masterpiece, we need to zoom out a bit and talk about how adolescence is typically portrayed in Western culture, and then examine how Margaret forges a unique path for itself. In the final volume of Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle, a 6-part, several thousand-page novel which covers the mundanity of the author's everyday life, Knausgaard makes an interesting observation about Leonardo da Vinci. How strange, Knausgaard muses, that Da Vinci's paintings should be so traditional when his studies into the medical, the philosophical, and the divine erupt from his pen with youthful excitement and wonder. How could a mind so relentlessly curious and focused on the cutting edge also produce paintings which so slavishly follow tradition? The simple answer is, of course, that Da Vinci had to get paid. The conversation is as old as art itself. Who gets to determine the culture of a time? The artists who depict it, or the patrons who pay for it? Knausgaard's novel maintains the same strange duality found in Da Vinci's work. At one end, it's a novel about the smallest details of life, the things usually glossed over in a story more focused on plot. My Struggle wanders, plotlessly, for hundreds of pages, flitting from one story to the next, moving on before any sense of narrative is able to take hold. Characters vanish for large sections and return unceremoniously. Time periods are moved between without regard to structure. It's a novel brimming with experimental glee, folding and unfolding on itself like an enormous house of cards. But that experiment rests in the tradition established by Marcel Proust or Richard Burton. For Marcel Proust, the point of a novel told in 7 volumes is to use time itself as an artistic resource. From Swan's Way to Time Regained, Proust uses a blend of autobiography and fiction to reveal the enormity of one man's inner life. Similarly, Richard Burton, the author of The Anatomy of Melancholy, turns what is ostensibly an essay about depression into a novel about human knowledge and suffering. All 3 of these projects are elements of an artistic expansionism, works that use time itself, the length of the piece, to forge new meaning. Knausgaard's contribution to expansionism isn't just the enormous length of his novel, but his lack of interest in saying anything self-consciously meaningful. He is, in essence, writing an anti-novel. No moments are meant to be more important than others. No attention is paid to rising action, to climax, or even to character development. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a real chore to get through. But that's the surprising thing about My Struggle. It's nearly impossible to put down. Reading My Struggle is like playing The Sims or Minecraft. It's just a space in which you live. These kinds of spaces in art fascinate me. Much like the film spaces of slow cinema covered in my first YouTube video, Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle is equally intoxicating as an environment. The unconventional approach to the novel that Knausgaard takes in My Struggle is an artistic gamble in that the novel is an investigation into the small, the domestic, the mundane, and it makes no overt attempt to pull the kind of narrative trick we are used to seeing in a novel. The traditional elements of the novel are in the spaces Knausgaard creates. We may not live in Norway, nor have any children, nor work as full-time writers, but we all have an internal life, complicated relationships with our families, daily chores, and routines we follow. And in this way, the novel is familiar enough to our lives for the more extreme elements, its immense length, its lack of central conflict, to feel less foreign to us. The history of art and culture is also the history of tradition and novelty. The friction between our constant desire for comfort and our fascination with the new is what perpetuates the constant flux of artistic evolution. Everything that feels unique to one generation will quickly become old, boring, and safe for the next. I remember this fact every time my students call the music of Miles Davis elevator music. The unique marriage of experiment and tradition can be found in many of my favorite works of art, from the Polaroid kaleidoscopes of David Hockney to the nightmare noir of Blue Velvet. Mixing the familiar with the unfamiliar asks audiences to become unsettled and see the familiar defamiliarized. The purpose of art varies depending on the audience. Some people want to feel comfortable, to escape, or to find hope. But just as many people want to be challenged, to gain a new perspective, or to wrestle with an uncomfortable truth. When we look back at the friction between artists and their patrons, a certain kind of narrative emerges. Artists have something to say, and patrons have something they want. The compromise, or lack of compromise, defines the product. That's how we get one of the most creative and innovative minds in human history, Leonardo da Vinci, to paint traditional portraits. Da Vinci's journals, on the other hand, were for himself. These were ideas he was able to freely explore based on the wealth he amassed from his famous patrons, the Medicis. The journals are exciting because there was no tradition established for the experiments he was conducting. Of course, the commodification of art occurred long before the Medicis. Portraits, landscapes, murals. The established traditions of painting, even Renaissance painting, color the way we see the world. As novelist Nathan Hill describes in his 2023 novel Wellness, the great landscape painters of the American Midwest during the westward expansion never painted the Great Plains as they actually were. The Great Plains, with their flat grain as far as the horizon, were such an alien sight for European art collectors that the painters were instructed to adapt these landscapes with more European landmarks. The patrons insisted that the paintings lie about what pioneers found in North America, and when the fiction of these paintings entered galleries, the fiction became false proof of Midwestern landscapes. When we say life imitates art, we sometimes mean that art teaches us how to live. We live vicariously through these other people, and we let their behavior color our own. However, like the distorted Great Plains of those 19th century landscapes, the confusing relationship between art and reality can warp the past itself. This is an episode of The Andy Griffith Show, which was broadcast during a time where televised representation was limited to 3 network channels. The Andy Griffith Show follows the happenings of a small American town in the American South, where the characters and the conflicts remain sanitized, simple, and squeaky clean for all 4 quadrants of its audience. To ensure maximum advertising prospects and a primetime television time slot, the show had to follow a long list of broadcasting rules to remain on air. Because of the enormous expense of creating a television show, the power rested in the hands of the patrons. The situation isn't so different from Da Vinci's paintings or the landscapes of the Midwest. The art had to match the tradition and the values of the patron, so it was the patrons who decided what was represented in art. In essence, the person paying for the art decided the culture of the time. When people look back fondly on the era of Andy Griffith, they are likely forgetting about all the problems of that period because the rules of advertising and patronage forbid them from being broadcast. What they're looking back at fondly never really existed. Have you ever heard a person from an older generation tell you that insert demographic here never existed when they were younger? The reason they believe that is because that demographic didn't appear anywhere in popular culture. The people who paid for it didn't want to see it, and because they didn't want to see it, they changed the perceived reality of the world they were in. It's painting a Great Plains landscape featuring rivers and mountains which were never there. This interrogation of artistic truth is the great experiment of Knausgaard's novel. Not that it dares to look at the mundane and the most intimate of detail, but because it in no way bends itself to the shape of contemporary literature. It is an anti-novel that somehow found success by doing exactly the opposite of what anybody would recommend or commission. In the world of filmmaking, we are seeing the Marvel franchise begin to stall out at the box office, and other tentpole sequels get middling receptions, both critically and financially. We are watching in real time how a patron's risk-averse economy can stymie creative novelty. If a movie costs $500 million, you have to guarantee that every single person in the world will want to see it. But if you are trying to entice that many people with a single product, you have to avoid making any creative decisions that feel new or exciting. With films that expensive, there's no room for the friction between art and commerce. It is just commerce. But what's the point of sending a landscape artist to paint the new world if you're going to make it look identical to the old one? The hand of the artist is what gives the piece life, but the artist requires a patron to devote time and energy to the craft. It's that tension between tradition and novelty that inspires audiences. What is something I have never seen before that simultaneously speaks a language I already know? That's why something like Star Wars can become such a phenomenon. It's a movie about an evil king, a young squire, an old knight, and a renegade smuggler trying to save a princess from a castle. It's one of the oldest and most consistent story structures in Western culture. Because the story so stringently follows tradition, the trappings of that story can be as novel as you want them to be. It doesn't always work, obviously. For every Star Wars success story, you have another big swing at that formula fail miserably. It's not so much chemistry as alchemy. Part of it is a magic we can't totally quantify. The paradox of making great art is that you have to say something totally new and something we all already know at the same time. You have to feel familiar but defamiliarized to stay interesting. On February 10th, 2018, Seth Stevens-Davidowitz published a study called The Songs That Bind, which found that most people just stop listening to new music sometime in their late teens, and that people frequently form their strongest emotional bonds to music at age 13 or 14. After that, the study claims, people are less likely to form strong emotional ties to new art, and in the case of this study, specifically music. We just simply feel more as teenagers. Our attachment to new ideas, art, and expression hits an all-time peak in the midst of adolescence. It's also the period of our lives where we are more likely to be open to ideas, concepts, and experiences than we will be as adults. This could be why Star Wars fans are impossible to please, no matter what new direction that franchise may take. It's not so much that people keep ruining it, perhaps, but it's impossible to make somebody feel the same emotions they felt when they were younger and more impressionable. No Star Wars movie will ever be as good as the ones you saw when you were 14 because your brain no longer functions that way. Looking at art aimed at teenagers or about teenagers, you see how adolescents are usually represented as several things all at once. They have the emotional extremes of a child, but they aspire to have the experiences of adults. That mix of youth and experience makes for compelling stories. Take Romeo and Juliet, an endlessly adapted story about teenagers feeling love for the first time and insisting on that love being true, real, adult love. They get married, consummate their marriage, and even die for one another, all in the span of about a week. If the story was about people in their 30s, it would make no sense, but the speed and ferocity of this love makes total sense for characters who are 15. The malleability and varying successes of the many adaptations of Romeo and Juliet hint at our strange relationship to stories we already know, and the many ways we can adapt those narratives to fit our notions of reality. The dozens of versions of this story permeate every corner of our culture, from the classical to the modern, from the serious to the silly. What compels us about the story of Romeo and Juliet is its inherent relatability. Most people fall in love, or at least want to fall in love, and most people have had to go against what their parents have told them. The novelty of Romeo and Juliet is that the stakes are much higher than a normal life. It takes what it feels like to be a teenager and makes that aspect concrete. When you're 15, everything feels like a matter of life and death. So Shakespeare takes that perception and makes it reality. For Romeo and Juliet, it doesn't just feel like life and death, it is life and death. When we're young, we relate to that immense pit of emotion these characters are feeling, even if we can't relate to the extremity in which they feel it. Adulthood is a long flattening of those raw nerves of adolescence. We stop trying on different personas and settle on the ones which work best for us. Change becomes more seldom, and routine dominates our lives. Fiction is about contrast. It's about conflict. Routines are broken away from in our fictional narratives, and in that way, every story can be considered adolescent. Conflicts about identity, mortality, romance, death, and destiny are the stories of how we grow up. Adolescence is about becoming who you're going to be, and that's also the nature of a story at its most essential. Another Shakespeare story, Hamlet, understands the adolescent's search for identity and meaning. While Romeo and Juliet is about working against the systems that restrict our choices and our lives, Hamlet is about the identities we forge on our way to adulthood. What makes Shakespeare's stories so timeless is their insistence that the emotions we feel as an adolescent never go away. We just get better at hiding them. Shakespeare's frequent use of adolescence as a central motif in his works speaks to how uniquely suited that period of our life is to the human experience and to the stories we tell. There is perhaps no greater time of change than your teenage years, and watching a protagonist learn a difficult lesson or butt up against the circumstances of their lives is in itself the story of growing up, leaving home, and forging your own path. Adolescence is, in itself, a constantly shifting marriage of tradition and novelty, and in that way, adolescence is a lived version of what we find most compelling in the stories we seek out. As a teenager, you truly feel as if you're the first person to ever experience these strong emotions, or the only person who understands what it's like to go through challenges. But the reality is that everybody is, and always will be, experiencing all of these same emotions. A story like Romeo and Juliet works because it speaks to the singular selfishness of a young person beating against the systems they're only just now starting to recognize. It's when we start questioning authority and all of the values we've been raised with. That's what makes a novel like My Struggle so unique. It's not that it's long or even that it's lacking in structure, but that the central conflict of the novel has nothing to do with personal change or self-actualization. Karl Ove as a character rarely learns or grows, and the novel has no interest in whether the events of his life are acting as agents of change. Instead, My Struggle is a series of events, routines, and markers of identity which have already come to pass. It's a novel about an adult with adult observations, even when the events depicted focus on the teenage or childhood years of the main character. That experiment paid off for Karl Ove Knausgaard as his book went on to become an international phenomenon, selling over 500,000 copies in over 35 languages. Reading the novel, all 6 books of it, highlights the brevity of life. A man's entire lived experience is boiled down to just a dozen extended sequences, and the structure of the novel speaks to the rubber banding of time. Half of Book 1 focuses on a single night of Karl Ove's life, and really just a couple hours of it, where he purchased beer for a party and then spent the rest of the night trying to transport that beer from one house to another. The novel uses microcosm, these small, intimate details, to paint a portrait of an entire world. The sequences of Karl Ove's adolescence, touched upon in Book 1 by further expanded upon in Book 4, also focus on the intensity of feeling associated with being a teenager, how every experience feels unique only to you, and like the most important story of your life. Like Shakespeare's great plays of adolescence, My Struggle points to the selfishness of young adulthood, the need to live in the adult world, but the limitations of not yet knowing anything about it. Knausgaard only knows how to behave because of what he's seen in movies, read in books, and heard in music. His entire personality is made up of the culture he's been exposed to. The media of his life has shaped his perception of it, and now he's making his own media, which by extension also defines the ways in which we view him. Late in Book 6, Karl Ove admits to having lied in several passages of his novel, but also notes that the ways in which he remembers his life now closely mirror what he has written. They mirror his lies. It's like he has obliterated the truth with his own filtered reality. For the past 10 years, I've been teaching high school. In those 10 years, I have seen the culture of adolescence change significantly. When I began teaching, my students were on Facebook and Snapchat, and they were obsessed with Marvel movies and TV shows. Now, 10 years later, my students admit to never really watching movies, finding them mostly boring. TikTok is their main social media, and Facebook and Snapchat are for, quote, old people. Communication isn't the main method of discourse anymore for many of my students. Now it is content creation and reactions to content, and then reactions to those reactions. Life is a resource for content, and that content is the truest representation of their lives. In essence, my students have all become different versions of Karl Ove Knausgaard, creating and recreating their lives, all the minutiae that comes with it, and defining themselves through repeated storytelling. Taking a moment, mythologizing it, reliving it, and allowing it to sprawl. In the 2007 comedy Superbad, directed by Greg Mottola, the protagonists, Seth and Evan, go on a quest for alcohol beverages to take to a party. The stakes are appropriately low for a teen comedy, but Seth treats the events of the film as if this night is the most important one of his life. For Seth, it's not just a Friday, it's the Friday. He knows that this night, one of the last of his senior year of high school, will come to define his teenage years. After 4 years of embarrassment, boring nights, and unsuccessful romances, Seth is hinging his entire memory of high school on a single night. Because it's a movie, the plot prevents Seth from success at every turn. They lose their liquor, the beer ends up in tubs of laundry detergent, Seth seemingly ruins his chances with his big crush, and he misses most of the big party. The big party motif of stories about teenagers has been around for as long as narratives about teens. So much so that my podcast, Creative Destruction Podcast, which overanalyzes Disney Channel original movies, has made the big party plot element a part of our weekly bingo card. In Romeo and Juliet, it's a big party where the titular character's fates are sealed. In Hamlet, it's a party where Hamlet decides to accuse his uncle of murder. Half of Volume 1 of My Struggle is a detailed account of how Knausgaard smuggled alcohol to a party as a teenager. Teen movies like American Pie, 16 Candles, Can't Hardly Wait, and Scream all climax at a party, and it's these events where futures are sealed and destinies are established. The party is a step into the adult world. The common thread between all of these parties throughout the teen genre is the lack of parental guidance or support. The point of the party is transgression, of forming unique societal norms and establishing a new kind of lived space. Many of these films feature the same characters all together in more traditional and formal settings, such as a classroom. The only difference between these interactions is the context of the space itself. A common trope of the teen movie party is the intrusion of adult problems. Characters decide to sleep together for the first time, or they get into fistfights, or they use recreational drugs. The party is a trip into an idealized form of the adult world, but the films frequently remind us that these teenagers are just visitors, and they aren't yet ready to handle adult consequences. In Western media, the high school party is a rite of passage. It's a trope where characters are able to blur the lines of their strict social expectations. The goody-goodies drink, the bad kids give out good advice, strange couplings emerge, and the whole thing is broken up by the police, who throw the upended social dynamics back into balance. In Superbad, a running subplot is the story of two police officers attempting to ingratiate themselves to a young man named Fogel, Seth and Evan's friend who attempted to buy liquor with a fake ID, famously naming him as McLovin. The police officers, played by Seth Rogen and Bill Hader, remember a time when they were young and throwing parties of their own, creating something of a narrative loop within the text of the film. The police officers use their authority to ensure a younger version of themselves is able to experience his own self-realization at an important party. The party tropes of Western culture create spaces for young people to role-play as members of the adult world, and when teenagers watch these depictions of teen parties, they recreate them in real life. However, the reality of a crazy party will never match the imagined ones found in fiction. In the Season 3 episode of Gilmore Girls called Keg, Max, the protagonist, Rory Gilmore, attends a house party modeled after the parties frequently seen in teen movies. All of the characters make reference to other media involving parties, and they compare their own party to the ones they're used to seeing on screen. By Season 3 of the show, Rory has been in serious relationships with two different boys. Dean, her first boyfriend, is a possessive and immature partner who jumps to emotional conclusions too quickly. Dean is tall and handsome, but he lacks the intellectual curiosity that drives Rory's inner life. Rory's new boyfriend, Jess, is Dean's opposite. He is emotionally detached, aloof, and just as intelligent as Rory. Both of these boys attend the party, and both of them are attempting to fulfill the roles assigned to them as, quote, boyfriend at party. At one point, Jess and Rory go upstairs to a bedroom in the same way we've seen in films like Superbad or American Pie, but the two never end up consummating the relationship. However, downstairs, Dean is worried that Jess is taking advantage of Rory, so he decides to be the chivalrous boyfriend here to protect Rory's virtue. Both of these boys are fulfilling the scripted roles of high school experiences. However, neither of them gets what they want. Dean and Jess instead fight each other, and they both lose Rory. The central motif of Gilmore Girls is the subversion of plot expectations characteristic of other teenage entertainment. The characters are savvy to the tropes of Western media, and so many of their behaviors are a reaction to those expectations. For Rory, fulfilling those roles and living out those tropes is akin to being phony. Teenagers are excellent at spotting false notes in their peers, and their obsession with being genuine creates paradox. To seem real, a teenager will behave like other people they deem to be real, but the second they see it happening in another person, they spot the fake. The handful of generations who have read and fallen in love with the character of Holden Caulfield all know and understand the complicated relationships teenagers have with authenticity and imitation. They are playing roles, trying on different personalities, and following different archetypes and scripts of behavior. But they also can't tolerate anything other than the absolute truth. Western depictions of the high school party, especially in mainstream media, get perhaps the most holistic depiction of the authenticity dichotomy many adolescents go through. In the season 4 episode of Doug, called Doug Throws a Party, Doug invites his friends over for his birthday. The beginning of the episode sees Doug wearing more adult clothes than he typically wears throughout the show, and he wants to show an air of sophistication to his friends. He wants to appear grown up. However, when Doug enters his living room, it's clear that his parents have vastly different expectations for what Doug will want out of his party. The great conflict of the episode, then, is Doug's fear of being seen as childish when all he wants to be seen as is adult. When the school bully, Skeeter, asks the other kids if they want to play Truth or Dare, they all agree. Truth or Dare is, in essence, the authenticity dichotomy by way of a social game. You are either willing to be your authentic self, or you will have to endure a test of courage. Doug was a children's show. I first started watching Doug when I was 6 years old. My understanding of teenagers came in part through watching Doug and seeing how he and his friends interacted. When I went to my own parties as a teenager and when I played my own rounds of Truth or Dare, I thought in the back of my mind that, yes, this is how Doug did it, and so I'm doing it correctly. This reflexiveness between expectation and reality puts strange pressure on teenagers to create defining moments, and with the growth of social media as a form of permanence, teenagers are more and more creating cultural touchstones for themselves meant to be broadcast to others so as to create an artifact of their own self-mythology. That's how we get people who pay exorbitant amounts of money for concerts that will only be watched through a phone screen, so as to project for others a singular experience. Self-mythology is not new, of course, but the increasing expectation for young people to provide real-time public depictions of their own lives has resulted in an unhealthy feedback loop of emotionally detached scenarios in which young people depict their own mythology as it happens in fictitious, exaggerated ways. Blurring the lines between fiction and reality even further, young people use the language of fiction to discuss their own lives. Phrases like main character, canon event, villain, and character development are frequently used to describe everyday moments and interactions. Blurring these lines between fact and fiction is how we self-actualize in our adolescence. It's why young people so strongly bond themselves to certain characters or worlds, and why so many storytellers return to that time in their own lives to tell their most personal stories. The risk of self-mythology, of the authenticity dichotomy, is solipsism. If you're the main character, everybody else is just a part of your story. Their problems become extensions of your own. Their lives become symbolic of your experience. instead of situations divorced from your own life. What you deem inauthentic could be another person's lived experience and another person's greatest truth. In Margaret, Jeannie Berlin's character Emily is fed up with Lisa. Weeks earlier, it was Lisa who distracted the bus driver that ultimately killed Monica, Emily's best friend. And now Lisa has made it her goal to have this man imprisoned for negligence. Lisa's emotions regarding the case are so intense, and her behavior so selfish and aggressive that Emily has decided to distance herself from the teenager. Near the end of their long argument, Emily shouts,
"We are not supporting characters in the fascinating story of your life."
Lisa's inability to extricate herself from this situation is a form of self-mythology that follows her everywhere she goes. There's the way a person is supposed to act, and then there's the way people actually act. When these two versions of reality don't align to Lisa's liking, she lashes out violently toward the people around her. Like the fight scene in Gilmore Girls, we have a teenage character operating with what they believe is the truth. But the truth is much messier than we ever expect it to be. When I was remembering that episode of Doug where he plays Truth or Dare with his friends, I went to the Doug Wikipedia and read the episode summary to make sure I remembered it correctly. Listed next to the episode was the writers, and to my complete surprise, there was a familiar name staring back at me. Lonergan seems to have a particular gift for capturing the complicated relationships teenagers have between expectation and reality. In one of the many articles I read to prepare for this video, writer and director Kenneth Lonergan spoke about his inspiration for writing Margaret in the first place. Quote, "I think that's what's ruling the world is the Hollywood pandering to teens and what they think teens want. And it's having an unfortunate reaction. My daughter watches these teenage shows which are completely artificial. I mean, these teens with perfect hair and makeup, perfect bodies. And they're harmless shows in a way, most of them. They're just comedies, but there's something about how hip and in control the kids are that's so false that bothers me a bit. So I don't know that it's the teenagers that are doing it. It's the ruthless marketing to the teenage group that I find frightening, and that is completely the responsibility of the adults. What sets Margaret apart from its contemporaries is its lack of regard for commercial viability. If I were Fox Searchlight, I too would be really concerned about the box office potential of a film like Margaret. Like Knausgaard's My Struggle or the dissonant late-period works of Miles Davis, Margaret is a film completely disinterested in market viability. These are expressions of art unmarred by the prospects of audience, and as a result, Margaret's own production company failed to ever truly believe in the project, nearly shelving it forever instead of taking the final steps of a theatrical release. So what makes Margaret so uniquely uncommercial? First, as stated much earlier in the video, the protagonist isn't even called Margaret. Her name is Lisa, and there are no characters named Margaret in the movie. Second, the plot is sprawling and dark and complicated, resting almost entirely on the characterization of a young girl who is honestly annoying and unpleasant and self-righteous in all the ways a real teenager behaves. For stretches of the film, Lisa's behavior is caustic and cruel. She is rude and careless to her mother, savage to her friends, impulsive and selfish with her decisions, and sometimes completely unknowable, even seemingly to herself. She's the kind of realistic characterization of adolescence we rarely see in fiction because teenagers aren't really that fun to be around. Lonergan explains Lisa's behavior in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. "I find Lisa to be a kid, trying very hard in an overwhelming situation, trying very, very hard to do something about it and not doing it well. But with a teenager's cruelty towards her parents, a teenager's disappointment in grown-ups, a teenager's black and white view of things, which is very slowly beaten out of her by the realities of the grown-up world. That particular kind of person is frightening in a way, but she may have just as easily written in her diary and cried and told her friends about this terrible thing that happened to her. and this girl tries to do something about it. After Lisa accidentally causes the bus driver to run over a pedestrian, she becomes fixated on finding a solution to this tragedy. While accepting some of the blame herself, Lisa also goes on a mission to have the bus driver prosecuted for criminal negligence. The bus driver, played here by Mark Ruffalo, refutes all blame for the incident, and so Lisa takes it upon herself to pursue a case with the victim's best friend, Emily, played by Jeannie Berlin. While this case is the central conflict of Margaret, there are several spiraling plot lines surrounding Lisa as her trauma and guilt mount toward a breaking point. Lisa's mother, Joan, an actress played by J. Smith Cameron, struggles to understand with or connect to Lisa's struggles through this experience. In her attempts to connect to Lisa, Lisa just draws further away inside of herself. In a clever bit of storytelling, Lonergan frequently cuts to the same scene, played over and over again, from the play in which Lisa's mother performs in the starring role. As the film continues, the scene is performed more and more aggressively, matching the emotional toll Lisa's conflict has brought to her family. When Joan begins dating a man named Ramon, a conservative war profiteer played by Jean Reno, Lisa is cruel to both of them, unable to comprehend her mother's decision to be with a man so diametrically opposed to her in so many core beliefs. At school, Lisa argues with her teachers and classmates about literature and politics, growing more aggressive and hostile to any idea that isn't explicitly her own. The film's length allows each scene to play for longer than audiences may be used to, and the ensuing arguments and sometimes nonsensical monologues from Lisa lay bare the fragile and raw emotions of adolescence more realistically and fully than audiences may have ever seen. The self-sabotage and impulsivity of Lisa become anxiety-inducing and terrifying as we move deeper into her story. Lisa's confrontational attitude toward the adults in her life, who she deems cowardly and hypocritical, allow her to spiral out of control as we enter the third act. To watch Margaret is to spend 3 hours with a person rocketing towards self-implosion, constantly refusing the help of others and ignoring the logical ways to correct that trajectory. Because Lisa has grown up watching operas and teen movies, she believes herself to be the main character of a sprawling saga about her life. Every other person's tragedy is just window dressing for her own character development. If another person dies or suffers or avoids punishment or gets engaged to be married, Lisa is only capable of understanding those truths as part of the story of her life. Lisa's selfishness and self-reflexivity is the greatest cinematic expression of the authenticity dichotomy I have ever seen. She is both acting a role and living her greatest truth simultaneously. And while she changes her personality in seemingly every scene of the film, she cannot and will not allow others to change in the same ways. Like my struggle, the story of Lisa is the story of small moments in life captured in microcosm. Like the teen movies contemporary to Margaret, her story is heightened and conceptually ambitious. But what sets Margaret apart is its unwillingness to compromise how teenagers really are. It's possible that much of the negative critical reaction to Margaret upon release was a reflection of Lonergan's unwillingness to compromise with his own patrons. It's possible that critics were seeing paintings of the Midwest as it really is, and not how they wished for it to be. Margaret is a complex and difficult piece of filmmaking reckoning with the dark contradictions of adulthood, and we just watch as a character self-actualizes against the backdrop of a harsh and indifferent world. The characterization of Lisa is messy and confrontational, and her journey toward adulthood mirrors the reality of experience instead of the expectations of dramatic storytelling. Much like Knausgaard's My Struggle, Margaret lacks any effort to be commercially viable, and it uses its immense runtime to allow the audience to live inside this world. Where most movies would cut away, Margaret lingers in the discomfort of post-argument silence. Where most movies would give Lisa softer edges and crystallize life lessons, this film retains the messy contradictions of real life. My hope for this YouTube channel is to create a community of film fans who enjoy talking about movies of all kinds. If you made it this far into the video and you've never seen Margaret, do yourself a favor and watch it. If you've seen Margaret and just want to hear a guy talk about it for an hour, then I'm glad you stopped by. My ultimate goal for any of my videos is conversation. What are your thoughts on Margaret? What are some of your favorite representations of teenagers on screen? Do you agree or disagree with any of my points? My comments section is a place for discussion, and I plan to respond to every comment on all of my videos as long as it's physically possible to do so. Thank you for watching.